Hello, good evening. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Clement's in Ewell, and welcome to the V in the penultimate, as it's going to be, the V in the A to Z of Catholicism. Um, and the only thing I could think of really was V is for the Vatican, although in fact V is also for, I suppose, quite a lot of other things, like Viaticum would be another thing, which is rather more important. But what I thought is I'd talk about, just particularly as the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul is coming soon this weekend, I'd talk about the Vatican and why the Vatican is important. If you actually think about why the Vatican is important or how the Vatican came to be important, it tells you an awful lot about Catholicism. And it tells you rather a lot about Catholicism that you might have been in danger of forgetting. The history. We know about the Emperor Nero, who was a great entertainer. And there was recently an exhibition a couple of years ago in the British Museum about the Emperor Nero. And I went to see it. And one of the things this exhibition said was that the Emperor Nero was wildly popular with the lower classes of Rome, but he was hated by the upper classes of Rome. It was the upper classes, the senatorial class, that eventually got rid of him. But the ordinary people, the plebs, loved him. One of the things that the Emperor Nero did is he actually went on stage and forced people to listen to him singing and also acting and things like that. And of course, the upper classes regarded this as absolutely appalling, whereas the lower classes lapped it up. And of course, Nero was the guy who oversaw the transformation of Rome into a completely leisured society. Hardly anybody in Rome had a job, and they were all bored to death. And so panem et circenses started, bread and circuses. Nero, don't forget, was not elected emperor, was made emperor. It was the first emperor where there was a donative given to the Praetorian Guard. They all got given a cash handout when he became emperor, and that carried on. But also, Nero founded the circus, the circus of Nero. Now, the circus of Nero, the circus is a circle, and it's a round space in which games take place. And the Circus of Nero was built outside the city, to the northwest of the city, next door to a small hillock called the Vatican Hill. And here Nero used to stage his entertainments. And so there would be chariot races and things like that, gladiatorial contests and so on. And down what's called La Spina, the spine of the circus, down the middle of the circus, were various statues and various obelisks and so on. There was an obelisk in the middle of a Nero's circus. And intra duas metas, the metas were the turning posts for the chariots. Between the two posts, St. Peter was crucified. Now, St. Peter was crucified and allegedly upside down and left there to die for the entertainment of the crowd. So you could watch the chariot race and watch a dying man at the same time, which was pretty gruesome. But the crowd loved it and they lapped it up. And of course, St. Peter was the man whom Nero blamed for the fire of Rome. In fact, the fire of Rome was largely accidental. And Nero then rebuilt Rome in magnificent fashion after the fire of Rome, so it was rather a good thing. But he blamed the Christians for the fire of Rome. And St. Peter was arrested and he was crucified in the theatre, the Circus of Nero. Now, after he was dead, we don't know how long it took for the crucifixion to kill him. After he was dead, his followers took his body and buried it nearby in the cemetery at the Vatican Hill. And the cemetery was literally 200, 300 yards away. The Circus of Nero, which of course no longer exists, although the obelisk is still in existence, the Circus of Nero is roughly to the west of St. Peter's Square, and part of it covers what is now St. Peter's Square. Anyway, and so St. Peter was taken to a small tomb on the Vatican Hill. Now, his burial was very close by. This is interesting because all these people who got martyred or who died were buried nearby. We're told the tomb of our Lord was hard by the place he was Calvary. If you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, you'll discover Calvary is about 30 yards from the tomb of our Lord. And with St. Paul, who was executed on the same day by tradition, he was executed at a place called Trefontane. His body was taken to a place less than half a mile away, what is now St. Paul's Basilica. Now, so you had a tomb, but the tomb, obviously, the place where St. Peter was buried was noted. We're told that of our Lord, that the women saw the place he was buried in and noted it. And the place, the tomb of St. Peter, became a shrine. Then, with the reign of Constantine, a vast basilica was constructed over the tomb at St. Peter's and also at St. Paul's, a vast basilica. There had been a small church there before, but now it was a vast basilica. So vast was the basilica built for St. Paul's that they had to change the orientation of the church because St. Paul's tomb was right next door to the Ostian Way. They couldn't move the road, so they moved the church instead. The church faced the road, now it backs onto the road, so they had to move the road around. Now, the Basilica of Constantine was then stood for 1,300 years, 1,200 years. And then Pope Julius II, the patron of Michelangelo, decided that the Basilica of Constantine was simply not good enough. We've got pictures that people painted of the Basilica of Constantine. It was a rather messy looking building, it has to be said. So what Pope Julius wanted to do was knock down the Basilica of Constantine and build a modern, more worthy church. And this process took a very, very, very long time. Michelangelo was one of the first people to work on it, but also and Bramante, all these very great artists of the day. Now, what on earth was the point of this? Well, the point of this was the church was a reliquary for the bones of St. Peter. That's why they had to knock down the original basilica, because it was the place that was important. You couldn't just build a new basilica down the road. You had to build the basilica over the tomb of St. Peter. Now, in other words, the basilica was a fitting setting for the bones of St. Peter. First, you have the relics, then you have a chapel, then you have a basilica, then you have an even more magnificent basilica. Now, this tells you something very strange, which we might have forgotten, that the reason you go to St. Peter's Basilica, or people went to St. Peter's Basilica, was not because it was such a magnificent church, but because it was the place that enshrined the bones of St. Peter. And of course, when you go into the modern St. Peter's Basilica, the current St. Peter's Basilica, you look up, you look down, and you see this box which has the bones of St. Peter in the confessional. In the confessional, there's sort of a balustrade, and then you look down and you see where St. Peter is. Then above that is the altar, the papal altar, and then above that is the dome. And around the dome it says, Tu es Petrus, et super hanc Petram aedificabo ecclesiam meam. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So the actual church is built on the tomb of St. Peter. So it's quite literally built on St. Peter. And of course, the church, being the body of Christ extended throughout the world, is also resting on this foundation of St. Peter and the Petrine primacy. Now, we don't really think nowadays that relics are important anymore. It's a bit of a sad loss. And particularly in more recent times, people have tried to play down relics. But the whole point of people going to Rome for the Holy Year, like this year, was to see the relics of St. Peter and the relics of St. Paul. And that is why Rome became the centre of the church, because it was the resting place of the two apostles. Now, the first Holy Year, I think, was 1300. Am I right? I think it was, or maybe it was at 1350. I can't remember. But one of the people who went to this Holy Year was no less a person than Dante Alighieri, or whatever he's called, the Italian poet. And he talks about La Pigna, which is this huge pine cone in the Vatican, which used to rest on top of the tomb of Hadrian, but was then put in the Vatican gardens. He said it was so in the poetry of Dante, there's something said it was as big as the pine cone in the Vatican. So he'd obviously went to the Vatican during the Holy Year and he noted a few things down. And the other thing he said was there was only one bridge over the river to the Vatican in those far off days. And this was the bridge that leads up to Hadrian's tomb. And it's incredibly narrow. It's about as wide as this room. And he talks about how they had to put a wooden barrier down the bridge because there were so many people going to and from the Vatican, from the city of Rome, because the Vatican's outside Rome, in historic center of Rome, because there were no tombs inside the city limits. And he said the people going and coming, they were so, it was like watching bees going in and out of a hive. Now, they were only there for the bones of St. Peter and, of course, the bones of St. Paul in St. Paul's Beyond the Walls. So, what does this tell us today? This tells us that our pilgrimage is essentially a journey to a tomb. That's how pilgrimages start. They are journeys to tombs. And of course, some people try to have the other biggest place that people go to or went to and still go to in large numbers is the burial place of St. James, which is Compostela. And they also go to places where the Blessed Virgin Mary has appeared, Lourdes being the most famous. But essentially, it is a journey to a tomb. So, for example, you can go to, there are numerous ones in France, where you can go to, Assisi, the tomb of St. Clare, the tomb of St. Francis, Lisieux, the tomb of St. Teresa of Lisieux. You can go to Nevers, the tomb of St. Bernadette. You can go to the Rue du Bac in Paris, where the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared, and you can go round the corner to the tomb of St. Vincent de Paul. You can go to Viterbo and see the tomb of St. Rose of Viterbo, and so it goes on. That the idea of visiting somebody's tomb and quite often seeing their body on display lies at the heart of Catholic practice. Strange, isn't it? And I remember once going in to see the tomb of St. Rose of Viterbo, and there she was lying beneath the altar, and she'd gone black and crisp, and her teeth were sticking out like that. She looked a bit like a. And I was with somebody. I said, "Well, how long has she been dead?" I said, "Oh, I think she's sort of from the 19th century." But then I looked carefully. She died in something like 1250, so she was looking great for somebody who's been dead for 750 years. Anyway, but why? Why go and see a tomb? And of course, why go and see the archetypal tomb, the empty tomb, that of our Blessed Lord in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which was the original shrine of the Christians. But now there are hundreds of these shrines everywhere. There is also a saint on display in Westminster Cathedral, St. Robert Southall. So, what does this tell you about Christianity, the cult of relics? Now, one of the things that happened at the Reformation is that they soon, because it was so grandiose, the plan of St. Peter's, they soon ran into money difficulties and they had to raise money. And this did not go down well in places like Germany. And this sparked the revolt against the church. And of course, one of the things that Martin Luther did was he was particularly against the cult of relics, partly because he said, along with other people, but they've been saying for some time, that many of these relics had been forged, and partly because they said, well, salvation is through faith alone, and therefore a relic can't save you. Well, nobody said a relic could save you. The whole point of visiting the relics is that they are a reminder of what has been and a spur to pray more fervently. That's what a relic is. And human beings love relics. They love souvenirs, and that's what a relic is. And they love being in the place where it happened. Just a few years ago, it was something like the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. And a whole load of people chartered a ship to go to the place where the Titanic actually sank, 82 miles outside Cape Race in the Atlantic Ocean, and chuck flowers into the sea and be doleful and things like that. What a waste of time. But they like doing it. And, who are we to stop people doing what they like? Why? But because actually it's not a waste of time. The Titanic is still there at the bottom. And the Titanic, being a ship on which so many people lost their lives, counts as a tomb. And the visiting of war graves in the north of France, which I've done, and I've done it in Italy actually, and also the war graves in the north of France, in Picardy and Normandy and so on, and the D-Day beaches and so on. People still want to go there, don't they? Despite the relatives, a lot of them. Yes, I know. That's the main driving force. Yes, but we're all relatives of St. Peter as well. Oh yeah, and but there again, a lot of people have their relatives cremated and thrown away, and then that's it. They don't have a tomb to go to. But the idea of going to a tomb is incredibly important. And I don't know. And also Rome is the place. Rome is the place where these things happen. And T.S. Eliot says, you've come to a place where prayer has been valid, when he's talking about little kidding. So somehow or another, there's a very deep resonance with human beings of going to the place where all these things happened. Now, the Pope's cathedral is not St. Peter's in the Vatican. It's St. John Lateran. Now, St. John Lateran has a very ancient history. Again, it's on the edge of the city, but it's within the city. It's by the gate, the St. John's Gate, which is the start of the New Appian Way. The Lateran has a very ancient history because the Lateran was a palace that belonged to Constantine, and he gave the palace to the church, and the main hall of the palace was made into a basilica for Christian worship. And the adjoining palace became the Pope's palace. And that is where the Pope lived. So the first Pope to live in the Lateran was, of course, Pope Sylvester, feast 31st of October. Now, what happened was the popes in the 12th century 13th century, were taken off to Avignon. And they went and lived in the papal palace of Avignon. And this lasted for about 80 years. When they got back to Rome, the Lateran palace was uninhabitable. And indeed, if you go to the Lateran Palace today, there's a modern building, 18th century building. There's a few bits that are very old, which have been sort of encased in a modern building. And that's where the Holy Staircase is. Now, people in Rome are under the impression that the Holy Staircase is from Jerusalem. It's probably not. What it was is that the Holy Staircase was the way into the palace of the Lateran. And at the top of it's a place called the Holy of Holies, where the relics were kept. And the Pope would stand at the top of the staircase as people come up on their knees and then kiss the Pope's hand and then go and visit the relics. And that nowadays you can still go and visit the relics, but the idea is that this is the staircase on top of which Jesus was judged by Pontius Pilate. So you're doing a pious act, joining in the suffering of our Lord. Now, the Lateran Palace was therefore abandoned as the papal residence. The modern Lateran Palace is actually the headquarters of the Diocese of Rome. So the Pope had nowhere to live, so he had to go and live at the Vatican, where there was a palace. And gradually, the Vatican Palace, or the Apostolic Palace, grew until eventually it took over the whole Vatican Hill, all the way along there. They built a little place at the bottom of the garden, and then they linked the two up by two mighty corridors. And that became the Pope's residence. Then, of course, in the 18th century, the Pope got a bit bored living in the Vatican Palace, even though it had a lovely garden and so on, and decided he would move to somewhere more modern, the 18th century Quirinal Palace on the Quirinal Hill. So he did that. Then in 1870, the Piedmontese, the Sardinians, invaded Rome, and the Pope withdrew to the Vatican. They didn't hand over the Quirinal to the Italians, and the Italians had to blast open the door of the Quirinal with a cannon shot. So they stole it, you see. The Quirinal, for almost 300 years, had been the seat of the papacy, right in the middle of Rome, and it had a very long wing added on at the back for the cardinals for the conclave. And so most popes for 300, all the popes for 300 years were elected in the Quirinal and came out onto the Quirinal balcony to make themselves known to the world. Anyway, the Quirinal was then taken over by the kings of Italy. Then they were kicked out, and now it's inhabited by the presidents of Italy. And the Pope, that was Pius IX, then went back to the Vatican and declared himself to be, because he refused to compromise with the Italian state, he then declared himself to be the prisoner in the Vatican. And he never came out of the Vatican again until he was dead, when he went to be buried in the public cemetery of San Lorenzo in Verano. Now, and so it continued until the 1928. For 50 years, 58 years, the Pope was the prisoner in the Vatican. He never left the Vatican. And if you wanted to go and see the Pope, you had to go to the Vatican to see the Pope. But the Pope, in fact, quite often did not impart the apostolic blessing from the balcony, looking out on the square, but in the tribune of St. Peter's, looking into the basilica. Now, eventually, despite all these mutual anathemas, the Italian state made peace with the Vatican and vice versa, not by restoring the Vatican's extensive territories, the Holy See's extensive territories, which were quite enormous, because there was the whole of Lazio, the whole of central Italy, going right up to Bologna, right up to the borders of Venice. It was the Pope's personal territory. They didn't give that back, but they gave to the Pope, they recognized the Pope's dominion over this tiny area, which is St. Peter's Square, St. Peter's Basilica, and the bit within the walls of the garden of the Vatican, and the few buildings, the Vatican Apostolic Palace, and the very few buildings attached to that. Now, it's often misunderstood. The Pope's sovereignty had never been taken away. His territory had been taken away. His sovereignty had always been there. And the Lateran treaties acknowledged his territory, very reduced territory, but also acknowledged his sovereignty. The Pope had always been a sovereign who could send ambassadors and things like that. The Pope had been a sovereign since, I think, 737 AD. And therefore, the Vatican, or the Holy See, is the oldest sovereignty in Europe. And the Vatican City, as it's misnamed, because it's not really a city, is the most recent incarnation, if you like, of the oldest sovereignty in Europe. So the oldest government in Europe, sovereign government in Europe, is that of the Holy See, 737. I don't think anything goes back further than that. England wasn't a thing in 737, and neither, I think, was France. So now, the thing about this is, a whole load of people in England got really uppity. One was a man called Geoffrey Robinson, QC, who said that the Vatican should be abolished. Well, it's not up to Geoffrey Robinson to abolish the Vatican. That's a fact. And the other thing is, he can't abolish the Vatican because the Vatican's sovereignty is not a gift from the Italian government. The Italian government has recognized it, and other countries recognize it. If Geoffrey Robinson wants Britain to break off relations with the Holy See, then he's free to pressurize the British government to do so. But he cannot pressurize the world to abolish the Holy See any more than he can pressurize the world to abolish Croatia or Andorra or Switzerland or Malta, etc. It's not up to them to say, you could, I suppose, withdraw recognition from the Holy See. But I don't think anybody's ever done that. You can also break off diplomatic relations. Quite a lot of countries don't have diplomatic relations with the Holy See, but everybody acknowledges the Holy See is a sovereign body and with a territory. Okay? Now, is this important? The Lateran treaties, are they important? Well, yes, in the sense that it's good that the Pope does not live in another country. He does not live in a third country. He is independent of all other sovereigns. He does not rely on the toleration of other sovereigns or other sovereign states. One person who doesn't have this privilege is, of course, the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, who might, at the whim of the Turkish government, be expelled. Though the Turkish government probably will never do that, it's always a possibility. The other thing is, of course, the Patriarch of Moscow has not got much going for him theologically, because Moscow is of recent foundation. And he is in the pocket of the Russian government. I mean, that seems obvious. The Pope is not in the pocket of any government because he is an independent sovereign. So that's really quite important. The other thing, of course, is that the sovereignty of the Holy See, rather than the Vatican, the sovereign nature of the Holy See is seen in its ability to mint coins and in its ability to print stamps, and as well as send ambassadors and so on, and have an army, namely the Swiss Guards, which is the smallest army in the world. But also, it's offshore. Now, this is where it all becomes very complicated. The Vatican employs a huge amount of people, well, no, actually not a huge amount, several thousand people, who work for the Holy See. None of them are properly paid, because your contributions on the Feast of St. Peter and Paul doesn't go enough to pay them properly. And so what they get is they do get paid, they get a lot of privileges. And one of the privileges they get is shopping in the Vatican supermarket, which is duty-free. So if you want to buy a Mercedes, that is the place to buy it. But you've got to have the card that qualifies you to shop in the Vatican supermarket. It sells everything. Sometimes they refer to it as the Vatican commissary, whatever a commissary is. But you have to have the card. So if you're a Vatican employee, you and your immediate family, your shopping bill is going to be much less than anybody else's. Secondly, if you're very lucky, you will live in a flat in a very nice part of Rome for a peppercorn rent. Now, the Vatican owns numerous flats in Rome. It's got an immense property portfolio, and this is bringing in not very much because it's full of Vatican employees or their children or their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren or their cousins or their aunts. Because once you rent something out to somebody, then, you never get it back, for generations. So that also would be a huge subvention from the Vatican. So even though you don't get paid very much, you do get reduced tax-free goods, and you get a semi-grace and favour residence, if you're lucky. Now, these Vatican employees quite often form a sort of a cadre, in that they are all hereditary jobs, more or less. You've got to be in with the right people to get a job in the Vatican, because you don't have to work particularly hard, you don't get paid very much, but you do have a job for life, and you can live in reasonable comfort. And don't forget, there are a lot of people in Rome who are totally unemployed and very poor. So, for example, working for the Vatican is considered a great honour and a great privilege. And this would include the people who work in the chemist's shop in the Vatican, which is open to the public, and it would include the people who are what are called the San Petrini, who are these sort of guys who patrol the basilica and things like that, and also the Vatican gendarmes and so on, and also, the flunkies, of which there are really rather a lot. The vast majority of the curia are priests, but there are also an awful lot of flunkies as well. And then, of course, you've got the most notorious thing in the Vatican, which is offshore, the Vatican Bank. What can one say about the Vatican Bank except keep well away, because a lot of people who've been closely involved with the Vatican Bank have ended up under the Blackfriars Bridge. That was, I think, probably the greatest publicity coup, whoever planned that, everybody knows about Roberto Calvi and the Vatican Bank and Blackfriars Bridge. The actual connection between Roberto Calvi and Michele Sindona and that other chap and the Vatican Bank is not clear to anyone. It is, so that's great because you can speculate as much as you like. And then, of course, Archbishop Marcinkus and this, that, and the other, and so on and so forth. It's all very cool. And then, of course, just as that scandal was dying down, we had the scandal of that 15-year-old schoolgirl who disappeared. Now, and that was picked up by Netflix. It's been going on for about 30 or 40. La Emanuela Orlandi. Oh, you don't know a scandal? Well, I'm not one to spread scandal. However, her father, she lived in the Vatican, actually inside the Vatican, in a flat with her mother and father. And she was 15 years old. Her father was a messenger. So he was a courier. So he was a very, very lowly employee of the Vatican. But it was a rather valuable job because it came with a flat and duty-free food and this, that, and the other. And it's very strange. He was a messenger in the Vatican. So in other words, they say, take this letter to Cardinal so-and-so and he'll do so. You do you?
They have them in the civil service.
Do they?
They do. Yes.
Oh, how old are they?
Usually older.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Aren't they dying out?
Well, literally.
Yeah. Can't people send emails and fax?
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
Or commissioners.
They used to oversee your parking. Yeah. But one of the things is the Vatican would not use email until very recently. It all had to be in fax. Then faxes sort of died out, and so they had to use email, I think. But anyway, this guy used to carry messages in the Vatican. Emanuela went into the city of Rome to Piazza delle Cinque Lune, I think, not very far away from the Vatican, near Piazza Navona, for her flute lesson. Was it a flute lesson or was it her? Yeah, her flute lesson. And she disappeared and was never seen again. Now, Emanuela, in my humble opinion, it's very clear, very tragic what happened to her. She was kidnapped, raped, and murdered. That's what happens, unfortunately, to beautiful teenage girls who disappear in Rome. And her body would have been disposed of. However, there had been several other girls who had also been disappeared at the same time, who were almost certainly kidnapped, raped, and murdered. But because Emanuela came from the Vatican, her father worked for the Vatican, it was immediately assumed that there was some connection with the Holy See, which is ridiculous. Just as if you were a messenger in the civil service, people immediately saying, oh, well, Elizabeth II, she must have had something to do. And it was assumed by some that she'd been kidnapped to hold the Holy See to ransom, to force the Pope to do, I'm not quite sure what. And the Pope had refused to do this, and the Pope was to blame for the fact that Emanuela was being held somewhere or another and was still alive. The tragic thing is that the family of Emanuela has fallen for this conspiracy theory, hook, line, and sinker, and 40 years later, they still think she's alive. Or is it 50 years later? Her mother's still alive. And the brother fights on about this. Then they said that she was alive and she was living in London, being paid for by the Holy See and so on and so forth. She's clearly not alive, because if she was, she would have made contact with her mother. And then, of course, they said the mafia was involved, and the Freemasons were involved. The Vatican was involved with the mafia to try and get her back, that she was kidnapped with something to do with the assassination of Pope John Paul II and so on, that Pope John Paul II had told somebody that he knew where she was and so on, but there's no record of that. Then when Pope Francis met the family at some function, he just said to them, Emanuela is in heaven. But they can't accept that, I think it's very similar to the very sad case of Madeleine McCann. Madeleine McCann, I'm really sad to say, was probably killed within 15 minutes of being taken. That's what happened. So it's cruel to say to parents, I'm afraid your daughter is dead, but it's infinitely more cruel to say, I think your daughter may be alive or is alive, and this, that, and the other. And so the Ben Needham child in Greece, and lots of others. That's So Emanuela, may she rest in peace, as Pope Francis says, Emanuela is in heaven. But this endless scandal, and it's been revived by there was a very irresponsible film on Netflix about this, in which it tried to involve the Vatican Bank and this, that, and the other, and so on. It was all involved. There's no evidence whatsoever.
Is there an element of the wish to find the relics as one?
Yeah, I mean, well, with a lot of parents whose children are kidnapped, they do talk about, don't they? We want to bring him stroke her home.
Or have closure.
Yes, and that is perfectly reasonable and perfectly unsellable. And of course, if you look at the hostages in Gaza, some of whom are dead, 50 or so are dead, they're holding their bodies hostage. Because obviously, if you're Jewish, you do want to give somebody a proper funeral. It's very important for our Jewish brethren to have funerals. And if you're, and also if you remember the worst case in Britain, Leslie Ann Downey, Keith Bennett, not the Ripper, Myra Hindley, and what's his name? Ian Brady. Oh.
Jack the Ripper?
Jack the Ripper left the bodies, but with Mrs. Bennett, the mother of Keith, all she wanted to do was find the boy's body so he could be buried properly. And unfortunately, I think she died. Nobody knows where Keith Bennett's body is. It's somewhere out there in the moors and so on. And Brady took people to the moors and said, I think you can dig here, and so on and so forth. And that's terribly, terribly sad. Now, to get back to the Vatican, the Emanuela's case only became famous because of her connections to the Vatican, which was very tenuous, if you could put it that way. If her father had worked as a flunky for Berlusconi, probably there'd been a huge scandal about Berlusconi.
The problem is the Vatican is so secretive, and the banking situation is so complex and looking.
I agree.
So you can understand why people.
I think it's so secretive and so complex that even when you're telling the truth, everybody assumes you're lying.
Yeah.
And that is most unfortunate. The other thing is, people are always saying, why don't they open the archives? Well, hang on a sec, love. No archive on earth is open. Nobody can just rush into Kew, where the government archives are, and root around to their heart's content. The Vatican archives are incredibly complex, and they're open to scholars and so on. But then there's something in the Vatican called the secret archive, which is the stuff which can never be seen. The British government also has this policy of keeping archives closed for at least 50 years, isn't it? Until everybody's dead and so on and so forth. The Vatican's secrecy, quite often the Vatican just doesn't have very much to be secret about, but it acts in a sort of a rather shifty way. And so people assume they've got something dreadful to hide. One of the problems with the Vatican, and Andrew Brown, who was the religious correspondent of the Guardian, said, in the Vatican they believe in the Italian way of doing things. But even in Italy, they've given up the Italian way of doing things. And this is, of course, one of the problems with Pope Leo will have to face, is the modernization of the Vatican. This has been a big question ever since the time of Paul VI. The Americans pay for things, as do the Germans and the Swiss, and the Americans want a bit more of accountability. And they also want the internationalization of the Roman Curia, which has been largely achieved, but is heavily Italian still. The other thing is that the Vatican needs to be, obviously, the Curia needs to be more transparent. The Vatican's biggest money earner is not Peter's pence, but it's the sale of stamps, believe it or not, I think, and also the Vatican Museum. But there are lots of institutions that depend on the Vatican, which are soaking up cash, including several hospitals, which are losing cash hand over fist. The biggest loss maker for the Vatican is Vatican Radio, which no one has ever listened to, ever. And it costs a fortune. And nobody listens to it. Have you met somebody who listens to Vatican Radio?
Well, I listen to it.
Father Graham used to say.
Yes.
Wow. You're the first person I've ever met who's ever listened to Vatican Radio. How'd you pick it up?
Well, probably pick it up on YouTube or the internet,
Uh-huh.
or Well, I get something down every day from the Vatican.
Vatican News is slightly different. That's a
Yeah, but there
website.
is an element in there.
Yeah. Vatican Radio is actually broadcast long wave, medium wave, or
Yeah,
short
it
wave,
is,
or whatever. And it's got a huge plant north of Rome with huge aerials and so on.
Just speak Italian.
No, it's in all languages. There's a bit in English. It's like the BBC. But whereas if no, the BBC back in the day, the World Service of the BBC, if you remember that, we used to listen to that in Malta. And it's like that. But I don't think anybody is listening to it. And I don't think anybody's listening to radio very much anyway. Most people are listening to podcasts and then watching streaming services rather than listening to television. Oh, good. Well, that's good.
I know someone who worked in the Vatican in the legacy department.
Oh.
And this is many years ago, and he's kind of, you're right. His father's grandfather was a gardener in the Vatican.
Yeah.
And at that time, when he was over here, many years ago, they did get a lot of legacy.
Yeah, I suppose they do from the whole world. They do get loads. One of the things is the jobs in the Vatican are not open to what's called concorso, public competition, or what we call the civil service exams, which were introduced, if you remember, by William Gladstone in the 1868. The idea of if qualify, I mean, they are all. It's all by that terrible thing, raccomandazione. Now, if you go into any place in Italy which does the Italian way of doing things, you always meet somebody who's incompetent, at least one person who's incompetent. Quite often, they're all being incompetent, and you say, "Well, he's a real incompetent. What's he doing here?" They say, "Ma, lui è stato raccomandato." He was recommended, which literally means he's there not because he knows anything, but because of whom he knows. And this was, I remember, in most places, in most public Italian institutions, this was the case, like the post office, which was notoriously incompetent. But in the Vatican, I think it still is the case.
Civil service was very light. I mean, I got a job there because my dad was in the civil service.
Oh, no, but you did an exam.
Yes, but I mean, but you still you were bumped up quite. I was surrounded by people whose family worked there as well. So I don't know if it's like now, but it definitely was old school tied jobs for the boys in civil service.
I mean, Gladstone didn't want that, but in the Vatican, unfortunately, raccomandazione, and a lot of people want to work in the Vatican, and hence you have all these Vatican scandals. What about that other Vatican scandal about the Swiss guard who shot the commander and his wife and then committed suicide? Cédric Tournay, another one for the Google. That was a huge scandal and so on. So there have been lots of Vatican scandals and so on. And I think the word I'd like to say is what we need, what the Pope needs to do. Not that it's my job to tell the Pope what to do. I'm sure he knows this. Is we need transparency and accountability in the Roman Curia.
And everywhere else.
And everywhere else.
It's not here.
Yeah. Now, in every what? Well, I mean, again, one of the things is when he died, they all looked a bit shifty, and people jumped to the wrong conclusions. He'd been murdered. There's none. Yeah, but a lot of people in Italy think everybody who just drops dead is murdered.
But how do you look shifty when you're dead?
No, the people around him looked shifty. But I think you'll agree, all Italians, I mean, there's a bit of racism here. All Italians are shifty and untrustworthy.
Oh, I'm not shifty.
All right, okay, that's great. But in the eye, I don't know. I hate to break this to you, but in the eyes of a lot of us, any Italian is not to be trusted. I mean, and there is something called the Black Legend, isn't it? Because the shifty and untrustworthiness is particularly a mark of Catholics. And so you put a whole load of Catholics together, they're bound to be shifty and untrustworthy. And the Vatican is not to be trusted, etc., etc.
Their guilt arising from original sin.
No, it's their guilt arising from the Reformation, because they said that Henry VIII destroyed the monasteries because they were all corrupt, which is completely false. And therefore, once you've stolen somebody's money, you have to demonize them because you feel so guilty about stealing their money. Yeah. Anyway, on that happy note, we shall end. Any thoughts about this V?
Can I just say, you said St. Peter was crucified upside down, allegedly. I thought that was a fact.
It's according to an ancient tradition. Now, one of the things, while you mentioned that, some modern people in recent times have denied that St. Peter was ever in Rome. Now, this is new because nobody denied it for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, even ancient times. It was said, the See of Peter, the tomb of Peter, nobody ever said, oh, this is all fake. He was never in Rome. Some people have tried to make this out. Now, there's no evidence in the Bible that St. Peter was in Rome. It dates from very ancient tradition. It's hinted that St. Peter was in, but Papias, this person who wrote in the end of the first century, talked about St. Mark being the sidekick of St. Peter, and he wrote his gospel in Rome. But the tradition of St. Peter being in Rome and being the first pope is very ancient, but it's not in the Bible. And some people obviously want to deny this because it will undermine the legitimacy of the papacy. And one group that wants to do this is, of course, the Greek Orthodox are always doing this, and the Protestants are always doing this, and some sort of trendy Catholics are always doing this as well. There was some ridiculous person, I can't remember, who wrote that the bit which will be in the reading tomorrow, on the eve of the feast, when St. Peter's in jail and the angel releases him, this is in fact a story depicting the actual death of St. Peter. Well, that's not true. There's no evidence St. Peter was put to death in Palestine. St. Peter, there's lots of evidence based on ancient traditions, St. Peter died in Rome and that his tomb is a genuine tomb. Ditto St. Paul.
There's no writing, somebody said. We met Peter.
Yes. No, there is actually the letter of St. Peter, the first letter of St. Peter, which is his sermon to the catechumens at Easter. And then it's sent out to the rest of the world. That would indicate that he was in a central position, i.e. Rome. Yeah. Any other questions?
What's the other church in? Is it St. Peter in
Chains?
Gallicantu?
No, Gallicantu is in Rome. That's the place. Sorry, in Jerusalem. It would be of the where the cock crows. Yeah.
What's the one in Chains?
So Peter in Chains.
There's the box with the chains.
Yes. There's also the place where that's allegedly where St. Peter was imprisoned. But there's also the prison, the Mamertine prison, where St. Peter was allegedly imprisoned, which is a horrible pit on the little hill above the Roman Forum, where people were left before they were executed in the Forum. So it's quite possible because Peter was kept there. It's pretty certain that people like Caractacus were kept there before he was taken out and then released. And people like Cleopatra would have been kept there. That's why she committed suicide. That's in Roman triumphs and so on. It was sort of a holding cell for people who were about to be executed. Romans didn't believe in imprisoning you. They either exiled you or they executed you. They didn't have prisons as we do. I mean, it's cheaper, yeah. And people do say, defund the police and close the prisons. It's a good idea, isn't it? Any other questions?
There's one coming up. Well, there's also St. Clement's in.
Oh, yes, of course. It's very ancient. One of the most ancient churches, built on top of a Mithraeum. Yeah.
I've got a question while Andrew's looking at that. What's the name of the Pope?
Leo. I said it. I got it right. Yes.
Vatican scandal. Pius XII.
Oh yes.
Yeah. They have squozen that for all they are worth. And the defenders of Pius XII, I have to say, I've read several books in defense of Pius XII, have probably made things worse because their defense has been so shrill, it hasn't really been very convincing. There's no doubt about it. Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, who wrote Hitler's Willing Executioners, who also wrote something, A Moral Reckoning, in which he basically laid the blame for a large amount of the Holocaust at the doors of the church. a very bad book in my humble opinion. It certainly, that which we have done, that which we have failed to do, the omission of a forthright condemnation of Nazi policy by Pius XII is glaring. Pius XI condemned Nazi policy in Mit brennender Sorge, with burning concern, which was read in all German churches on one Sunday. It was smuggled illegally into Germany, and it condemned Nazism. He also condemned Italian fascism with the encyclical Non abbiamo bisogno. These were the only two encyclicals, one written in vernacular. One of the reasons why Pius XII, it is said, kept quiet is because when the Dutch bishops condemned the Nazis for their anti-Jewish policy, the Nazis retaliated by arresting, deporting, and gassing Jews who had become Catholics, who until then had been left alone. And one of the Jews who'd become a Catholic, who'd been deported to Auschwitz and gassed from Holland, was, of course, St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, aka Edith Stein. And some people say this so shocked and terrified the church, they said, if we condemn the Nazis, we'll just make things worse. Now, that is one form of reasoning, probably not a good one, but it is a form of reasoning. One of the things is, of course, it's a bit like saying, if we assassinate Hitler, we'll just get somebody worse. Well, yes, maybe, but maybe no. If we get rid of Putin, we'll get somebody worse and so on. If there were very strong condemnations of Nazism by the Bishop of Munster, von Galen, he was called, who suffered no consequences. But in Holland, it was a disaster. All the better. You're on the internet.
That was operating an escape route for Jews out.
There were numerous. One of the things is, if you look at the thing that Daniel Jonah Goldhagen fails to take on board, is there are 3 countries which have a very good record for protecting Jews and who have the least Jews killed. One was Bulgaria, one was Denmark, one was Italy. Bulgaria is Orthodox, Italy is Catholic, and Denmark is Protestant. Effectively, the religion of the country made very little difference. But there were lots and lots of Italians who protected Jews when Italy was occupied by the Nazis, which was late on. The worst place for Jews being murdered was, in fact, Holland. But nobody blames the Dutch for that. It was to do with the fact that there's very little countryside, very few places to hide in Holland, you know. And of course, Hungary. I mean, there were certain places which were really bad, and the worst was obviously Hungary, where they sent the Jews to death when they knew that the Germans were losing the war. Quite astonishing. And the other thing is, of course, if you look at the pattern of voting in Germany before Hitler came to power, the Catholic parts of Germany were strongly opposed to Hitler, whereas the Protestant parts were strongly for him.
But they were told that the Catholics supported it.
Well, no, the Catholics.
Well, von Papen was it?
Von Papen was a Catholic, but von Papen. Yes, but more than everybody else. But von Papen had left the Catholic Centre Party. When the enabling bill came about, the Catholic Centre Party collapsed and voted for Hitler, which was not good. But the actual Catholics in the street, the majority of them were very much against Hitler. One of the very sad ironies of history is that the Versailles Treaty forbade Austria to unite with Germany. If Austria had united with Germany, it would have been a majority Catholic country, and they probably would never have elected Hitler. But that's a terrible what if.
Catholics have voted for Trump.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Any other questions? No? Okay, we've finished, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with W is for welcoming.